Title: The bully yells at an elderly man on the street, stunned when he flashes his police badge. The grimy New York afternoon clung to James Carter like the city's relentless humidity. He was a ghost in the throng, a stoic figure swallowed by the relentless tide of commuters surging towards Grand Central. 70 years had weathered his face, etched lines of hard-won experience around eyes that still held a piercing glint. He moved with a measured pace, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed out of sync with the frantic energy of 42nd Street. The air crackled with the impatient buzz of a city in perpetual motion. Car horns blared a discordant symphony, punctuated by the screech of brakes and the garbled announcements spilling from overflowing buses. James, oblivious to the cacophony, focused on placing one foot in front of the other, his thoughts a million miles away, buried deep in the labyrinth of a past he'd fought to both remember and forget. Then, the wall of bodies parted, revealing a cluster of younger men. They moved with a swagger, their voices loud, their laughter abrasive, cutting through the background noise like a shard of glass. Leading the pack was Mike Reynolds, a young man built like a linebacker with a face hardened by early experience, radiating a dangerous aura of bored entitlement. Mike's gaze fell on James, and a sneer twisted his lips. The old man was holding them up. In Mike's world, time was money, and everyone else was in his way. "Look at this fossil," he barked, his voice laced with derision. "Come on, Gramps, are you trying to break a record for slowest walker?" His crew, a motley collection of wannabe tough guys, snickered in agreement. They fed off Mike's energy, eager to prove their loyalty with a well-placed insult or a shove. "Yeah, Grandpa, you're blocking the whole sidewalk," one of them chimed in, nudging another with a knowing smirk. The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably, averting their eyes, desperate to avoid becoming collateral damage. In the dog-eat-dog world of New York, intervention was a risk few were willing to take. Self-preservation was the only law that really mattered. Mike, fueled by the silent approval of his audience, stepped closer to James, his face inches from the older man's. "Maybe you need a little help getting out of the way, Pops," he threatened, his voice dripping with menace. "You deaf? Move it or lose it." James remained impassive, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't quicken his pace. He simply continued his steady march, a silent defiance that infuriated Mike. The old man's blatant disregard was a direct challenge to Mike's carefully constructed image of authority. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man," Mike shouted, his voice rising in anger. He reached out, his hand closing around James's shoulder, ready to shove him aside. "You gonna listen now, or what?" The tension hung heavy in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. They braced themselves for the inevitable explosion. Just as Mike was about to apply force, James moved. It wasn't a frantic struggle, nor a panicked flinch. It was a movement smooth, economical, honed by years of training in countless confrontations. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even break eye contact. With a casualness that belied the underlying power, he reached inside his worn leather jacket. Instead of a weapon, he produced a small, worn leather wallet. He flipped it open with a practiced flick of the wrist, revealing a tarnished metal badge. The glint of gold against the deep blue of the wallet caught the afternoon light. The word FBI was embossed in bold letters above the seal. Below that, etched in a smaller font, was the name, Special Agent James Carter, retired. The effect was immediate and electric. Mike's hand froze on James's shoulder. The sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. The laughter of his crew died in their throats. The hum of the city seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a sudden, pregnant silence. The crowd, previously a sea of anonymous faces, suddenly coalesced into individual observers, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and apprehension. A retired FBI agent? Standing right here, James closed the wallet with a snap, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet. He didn't need to say anything. The badge spoke for itself. He held Mike's gaze, his eyes, the color of weathered steel, boring into the younger man with a force that felt almost physical. Those eyes had seen things, witnessed horrors, judged countless souls. They were eyes that didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't forgive. Mike swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating like morning mist. He tried to pull his hand away, but his fingers seemed to be frozen in place, clinging to James's jacket as if for support. He stammered, I didn't know. The words came out as a weak whisper, barely audible above the distant drone of the city. James didn't reply. He simply continued to stare. His silence more intimidating than any shouted threat. He saw the fear flicker in Mike's eyes, the uncertainty that lay beneath the carefully constructed facade of aggression. He'd seen it 1,000 times before, in the faces of hardened criminals, corrupt officials, and desperate men on the run. One of Mike's friends, a wiry kid named Tony, nervously tugged at his sleeve. "Mike, come on, man," he hissed. "Let's just go." Mike, still reeling from the unexpected revelation, hesitated. He couldn't back down now, not in front of his crew. He had a reputation to protect, a fragile ego to defend. But the fear was winning. He tried to regain his composure, to salvage some shred of dignity. "Look, old man," he said, his voice still trembling slightly. "I didn't mean anything by it. Just messing around." James finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that resonated with authority. "Messing around can have consequences, son." His gaze swept over the group, taking in their nervous glances and shifting feet. "Choose your targets wisely." He then turned and continued his walk, disappearing into the throng as quickly as he had appeared. The crowd parted before him, giving him the space he commanded. The city seemed to hold its breath as he passed. The tension lingered long after James had disappeared. The crowd, buzzing with nervous energy, began to murmur amongst themselves. The name, James Carter, was whispered from mouth to mouth, laced with a mixture of awe and disbelief. An elderly man, his face etched with wrinkles and his eyes sparkling with recognition, stepped forward. He was dressed in a faded suit, his hands gnarled with age, but his voice was clear and strong. "James Carter," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "That's James Carter, the FBI agent. He used to be all over the news." Mike and his crew stared at him, dumbfounded. They just harassed a living legend. He solved the first national bank heist back in '95. The old man continued, his voice filled with admiration. "Single-handedly brought down half the Italian mafia, I heard. They called him the Ghost. A wave of whispers washed over the crowd. The Ghost. That's him. I remember now." Mike's friend, Tony, grabbed his arm, his eyes wide with panic. "Mike, you don't understand. Carter was a legend. He's taken down some seriously bad people. We gotta get out of here." Another of Mike's associates, a hulking figure named Vinny, who usually reveled in intimidating others, now looked genuinely scared. "Yeah, Mike, Tony's right. You don't mess with a guy like that." Mike, his face pale, struggled to comprehend the situation. He'd just picked a fight with a retired FBI agent. A legend, a man who had probably forgotten more about being tough than he would ever know. His carefully constructed image of invincibility crumbled around him like a sandcastle in the face of a rising tide. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm him, Mike remembered the old man's words. He focused on the part about messing around. He knew what that meant. He knew how much it could hurt. As his friends argued, James's voice echoed in Mike's mind, "I've seen your kind before. Bullies who prey on the weak because they think they can. But I have one question for you. When you're in real trouble, will those you call friends stand by you?" It was a simple question, but it struck a chord deep within Mike's soul. He looked at his crew, at their nervous faces and shifting eyes. He saw not loyalty, but fear. They were only with him because he was the top dog, the alpha male. If he fell, they would scatter like rats fleeing a sinking ship. He suddenly understood the emptiness of his existence, the shallowness of his friendships, the futility of his aggression. He was a bully, yes, but he was also deeply, profoundly alone. The days following the incident on 42nd Street were a blur for Mike. He couldn't shake the image of James Carter's steely gaze, the weight of his words. He found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about himself, about his friends, about the world, one evening. As Mike sat alone in his cramped apartment, staring blankly at the television, Tony knocked on the door. "Mike, can I talk to you for a minute?" Tony asked, his voice hesitant. Mike, surprised by the uncharacteristic timidity, opened the door. Tony shuffled inside, avoiding eye contact. "What's up, Tony?" Mike asked, his voice flat. Tony hesitated, then blurted out, "Look, Mike, I know why you're like this. I know about your dad." Mike froze. The air in the room seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. The mention of his father was like a raw wound, a pain he had buried deep inside. Tony continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw him. I saw him hitting you when you were a kid. That's why you're always so angry, why you have to be in charge." Mike's carefully constructed wall of denial crumbled. The shame, the humiliation, the buried rage, all came flooding back. He felt like a child again, small and helpless, cowering in the face of his father's fury. James Carter was right, Mike thought with a jolt. All the bullying, the aggression, the need to dominate, it was all a desperate attempt to mask his own weakness, his own fear. Just then, it was as if Carter magically appeared in his doorway. "You get to decide your path, Mr. Reynolds," Carter said. "Continue the endless violence loop, or end it now, before it is too late." With that, Carter seemed to disappear as fast as he appeared. A week later, Mike was walking through a park when he saw a group of older boys harassing a smaller kid, just like he had done to James Carter. His first instinct was to walk away, to avoid getting involved. But then he remembered James Carter's words, the image of his father's rage. He hesitated, his stomach churning. He knew what it was like to be the victim, to feel the crushing weight of fear and helplessness. He couldn't stand by and watch it happen to someone else. Taking a deep breath, Mike walked towards the group. "Hey," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Leave him alone." The bullies, surprised by the intervention, turned to face him. They were bigger than the kid they were harassing. But they weren't bigger than Mike. Mike towered over the group with an unyielding presence. "Mind your own business," one of them sneered. "This is my business," Mike replied. "He's not bothering anyone. Just leave him alone, or you'll have to deal with me." The bullies, sensing the genuine anger in Mike's voice, backed down. They mumbled some insults and swaggered away, leaving the smaller kid trembling in their wake. Mike approached the boy, offering a hand. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentler than he thought possible. The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks." As Mike walked away, he felt a sense of lightness, of relief. He had done the right thing. He had broken the cycle of violence, at least for one day. Emboldened, Mike sought out James Carter at the local diner he frequented. "I'm sorry about what happened back on 42nd Street, Mike said. "And I'm ready to make a change, but I don't know where to start." James smiled and nodded, but asked, "How far have you gotten?" Mike told the story of what happened at the park. A sense of confidence grew in James. "Everyone can be redeemed," James said. "You've taken the first step, now you must continue." A year later, Mike was a changed man. He was a volunteer at a local youth center, helping troubled teenagers find a better path. He was still a work in progress, still fighting his demons, but he was no longer the bully he once was. He occasionally saw James Carter around the neighborhood, the old man still walking the streets with his measured pace. They would exchange a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both taken. One day, Mike saw a group of teenagers harassing an old woman on the street. He remembered his run-in with James Carter and the shame it brought. Without hesitation, Mike intervened, protecting the woman and scaring the bullies away. As he walked away, he smiled. He had finally found his purpose, his redemption. The story closes with an image of Mike standing on the street corner, watching the city go by, remembering the moment he had been confronted by a legend, the moment his life had changed forever. He was still a part of the concrete jungle, but he was no longer trapped by it. He had found his own way, his own redemption, and he was ready to face whatever the future held.